The repetition of the same mistakes in human life may seem, at first glance, like a simple failure to learn. However, according to Carl Jung, this dynamic has deep roots in the psyche, tied to unconscious patterns and the search for meaning. It's a complex journey, blending shadow, archetypes, and the eternal conflict between the conscious and the unconscious. Jung described the unconscious as a force that continuously influences us, shaping our choices and behaviors, often leading us to repeat mistakes we believe we've overcome. He identified that this repetition is not random. There's something within the psyche that draws us to familiar, albeit painful situations. Why does this happen? First, there's what Jung referred to as complexes, clusters of repressed emotions and ideas with their own energy. Intense experiences, especially in childhood, create unconscious emotional associations. For instance, someone who grew up in an environment where love and criticism were intertwined may, in adulthood, seek relationships that replicate this dynamic without realizing they're recreating a familiar yet unsatisfying scenario. Jung believed complexes function like invisible magnets. They attract circumstances, people, and decisions that reinforce their existence. In other words, it's not our mistakes that repeat, but the unconscious patterns sustaining them. Another key concept is the shadow, which Jung described as everything we deny or repress about ourselves. Our shadow contains both negative aspects and latent potential. The problem is, ignoring it doesn't make it disappear. Quite the opposite, it strengthens within the unconscious, indirectly influencing our choices. When we avoid confronting the shadow, it tends to manifest in external situations. We repeat mistakes because we refuse to acknowledge what's hidden within us, our insecurities, fears, or even strengths we're afraid to express. For example, someone who repeatedly chooses emotionally unavailable partners may be reflecting an unconscious fear of intimacy. In this case, repetition is a sign that something within must be faced. Jung also saw mistakes as a form of symbolic learning. We repeat patterns because, on a deeper level, we are trying to understand something about ourselves. Life, for Jung, is teleological, driven by purpose. Even our mistakes serve as messages from the unconscious. When we ask, "Why is this happening again?" we're actually facing an opportunity for self-discovery. For example, imagine someone who repeatedly faces professional failure. This person might feel as if life is conspiring against them. But from a Jungian perspective, the failure could be revealing something deeper. Perhaps a repressed desire to pursue a different path or the need to develop a specific skill. Jung emphasized that as long as we remain unaware of these patterns, we are doomed to repeat them. In his words, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." If we repeat the same mistakes because unconscious forces govern us, the way out is to bring these forces into the light of consciousness. But how do we do that? According to Jung, the key lies in a continuous practice of self-awareness. This requires courage, as looking inward means confronting aspects of ourselves we'd rather avoid. A vital tool in this process is individuation, a central concept in Jungian thought. Individuation is the journey toward becoming whole, integrating the conscious and the unconscious. It doesn't mean eliminating mistakes, but learning from them. By integrating the shadow and complexes, we break the cycle of repetition and begin to live more authentically. The first step toward individuation is awareness. Often our mistakes manifest in clear patterns. A person might notice they always choose jobs that make them unhappy, or that their relationships follow the same destructive trajectory. These patterns act as maps pointing to what's hidden. For Jung, dreams are a crucial window into the unconscious. Paying attention to dreams can reveal symbols and archetypes representing our inner conflicts. A dream of being trapped in a labyrinth, for instance, might reflect a sense of stagnation. Repeating mistakes, then, is the echo of something deeper, a call from the unconscious to be heard. Another clue lies in emotional triggers. Situations or people that provoke disproportionate reactions are often tied to complexes. If something relatively small causes an intense response, it's likely connected to an old wound. Understanding these triggers is like following a thread to the core of the issue. Once we identify repetitive patterns, the next step is to confront our shadow. This means acknowledging, without judgment, the aspects of ourselves that have been feeding these mistakes. For example, if someone realizes they struggle to set boundaries, they might uncover, upon exploring their shadow, a fear of rejection or a need to please others. Recognizing this not only changes behavior, but also reveals its roots. Interestingly, the shadow isn't solely a source of harm. Jung pointed out that it also contains talents and potentials we repress out of fear or societal norms. For instance, someone who avoids conflict at all costs might discover, through shadow work, the inner strength needed to stand up for themselves. Integrating the shadow requires self-acceptance. This doesn't mean excusing harmful behaviors, but acknowledging that we are complete beings with both light and darkness. The closer we come to this wholeness, the less we rely on unconscious patterns to guide our lives. Jung believed that suffering is an inevitable and even necessary part of the growth process. We repeat mistakes because the pain they cause forces us to pay attention. Rather than seeing suffering as something to be avoided, we can approach it as a teacher. Each mistake becomes a lesson, an invitation to look deeper within ourselves and discover something new. This perspective contrasts sharply with the modern tendency to seek quick fixes. Self-knowledge, as Jung taught, is a slow and demanding process. But it's precisely this work that frees us from the fate of repeating the same patterns. Jung also linked our repetition of errors to archetypes, universal patterns of behavior and meaning residing in the collective unconscious. Archetypes such as the hero, the sage, or the shadow shape our psyche and symbolically guide our choices, often outside our conscious awareness. For example, someone influenced by the martyr archetype might repeatedly sacrifice their own well-being for others. While this may seem noble, it can lead to exhaustion or bitterness. Unknowingly, this person is following an archetypal script that, if left unexamined, will continue to drive self-destructive decisions. Another example is the lover archetype, which might cause someone to prioritize emotional relationships, often overlooking red flags. This repetition could reflect a deep desire for connection or validation, something that can only be fulfilled by integrating these needs internally rather than compulsively seeking them externally. To break these cycles, Jung suggested it's crucial to identify which archetypes are most active in our psyche and understand how they shape our choices. This awareness allows us to transcend automatic patterns and live in a more balanced and authentic way. Another key factor in the repetition of mistakes is projection, an unconscious mechanism where we assign to others aspects of ourselves that we don't recognize or accept. According to Jung, projection is inevitable, but it becomes dangerous if left unchecked. For instance, someone who constantly chooses partners who seem controlling or critical might actually be projecting their own self-criticism or need for control, qualities they haven't yet acknowledged as part of themselves. Instead of confronting these traits internally, they see them in others, perpetuating a cycle of frustrating relationships. Projection also works positively. We often idealize people or situations, attributing to them qualities we feel we lack. A person who is repeatedly drawn to charismatic figures, for example, might be projecting their own untapped potential for leadership or creativity. Removing projections helps us see ourselves and others more clearly. This process requires honest and ongoing self-examination, but it is essential for breaking repetitive patterns. Jung's approach reminds us that growth comes from within. Recognizing the archetypes at play, confronting our projections, and embracing the lessons in our suffering allow us to reclaim agency over our lives. By integrating what lies hidden in the unconscious, we stop repeating the same mistakes and begin to live with greater freedom and purpose. Jung emphasized that free will can only be truly exercised when we become aware of the unconscious. As long as we act automatically, we remain prisoners of what he called the compulsion to repeat. But when we shed light on the forces that govern us, we gain the freedom to choose differently. Choosing differently, however, isn't just about making a rational decision. It requires alignment between the conscious and unconscious. To achieve this, Jung recommended practices like active imagination, where we engage in dialogue with symbolic aspects of our psyche, and dream analysis, which reveals messages from the unconscious. This process doesn't eliminate the possibility of mistakes, but transforms our relationship with them. Instead of being passive victims of recurring patterns, we begin to see our mistakes as parts of an ongoing dialogue with our inner self. Jung also highlighted how culture and the collective unconscious influence the repetition of mistakes. Often we follow patterns that are not just individual, but collective. Society transmits ideas, values, and expectations that shape our choices. For instance, a culture that prioritizes financial success above all else might lead many to repeat unsatisfying career choices, even at the cost of their emotional well-being. Here, the mistake is collective, but the individual experience reflects the struggle of living out of sync with one's true nature. Recognizing these influences is a key step toward breaking the cycle. By questioning the values we've internalized from society, we begin to chart a more authentic path. While unconscious and cultural factors play crucial roles in the repetition of mistakes, Jung emphasized that true transformation begins with personal responsibility. This doesn't mean blame, but the willingness to acknowledge that, consciously or unconsciously, we contribute to the patterns we perpetuate. Often we repeat mistakes because it's easier to blame fate, circumstances, or others than to confront our own limitations or fears. Jung warned that the eternal victim within us can be a powerful yet illusory figure. Staying in that role robs us of our ability to act and change. Taking responsibility, however, isn't self-sabotage. It's an act of courage. It's saying to oneself, I chose these paths, even unconsciously, and I can choose others. This moment of honesty with oneself is liberating because it reveals that we have more control than we think. For Jung, mistakes are fertile ground for transformation. He believed that life isn't about avoiding failures, but using them as a springboard for growth. Every mistake carries an opportunity. The challenge is to see what it's trying to teach us. For example, someone who repeatedly fails in business ventures might initially feel incompetent, but on deeper reflection, they might discover they've been choosing projects for external reasons, like status or validation, rather than aligning with their authentic values. The mistake in this case is a call from the unconscious to reassess what truly matters. Jung saw this dynamic as part of the individuation process. Mistakes are not merely detours on the path, they are the path itself. Through failure, we come closer to understanding who we truly are, uncovering layers of the psyche that were previously hidden. Breaking repetitive patterns is a process that takes time. In a society that prizes quick fixes and instant results, this may be one of the greatest challenges. Jung often reminded us that the psyche operates at its own pace, and forcing progress can be counterproductive. This process can be likened to the growth of a tree, invisible at first, but steady and irreversible when properly nurtured. Periods of apparent stagnation may actually be times of assimilation, where the unconscious is rearranging the pieces for deeper change. Practices like therapy, meditation, dream journaling, or simple moments of introspection can help accelerate this process naturally. The key is to cultivate patience and self-compassion. After all, the repetition of mistakes is a universal experience, and everyone navigates it at their own pace. When we finally break the cycle, it doesn't mean we'll never make mistakes again. It means we become more aware, more whole, and more in touch with who we truly are. This is the ultimate goal of individuation, to live an authentic life, where our choices are no longer governed by complexes or unconscious patterns, but by the integration of all aspects of ourselves. As Jung said, the true work is to become who you are. Paradoxically, it's often through the repetition of mistakes that we discover what it truly means to be ourselves. In exploring why we repeat the same mistakes, we uncover that they're more than just failures to be corrected. They are messages from the unconscious, opportunities for self-awareness, and integral parts of the human journey. When we stop fighting against them and start understanding them, they cease to be our enemies and become allies in our growth process. A mistake, therefore, is not the end, it's the beginning. It's the unconscious inviting us to look inward, challenge old patterns, and move closer to the wholeness that Jung so deeply valued. After all, as he famously said, there is no coming to consciousness without pain.